It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm going to talk sort of about the issue of affordable housing and the relationship between affordable housing production programs and the planning system in Sydney. And these are, sort of my impressions as an American. They say an expert is someone who knows less than you do, but came from at least 100 miles away. I know a lot less than most of you, and I came from about 7,000 miles away. This is my second stint in Sydney, as Nicole mentioned. I was here 10 years ago for 6 months, and I've now been here for 4 months. So I guess I have a combined 10 months of knowledge about Sydney and about Australia, but we really like it a lot. And one of the nice things is it's always nice to get a fresh perspective from someone who comes from a different system and sees a different system. So let me take a second here to see if I can get my presentation up. There we are. And so let's see. Can you all hear me? Is that okay? So I'm going to talk about improving housing affordability and mostly expanding the production of affordable housing in Sydney and New South Wales. And it gives you some examples from the United States. And I'm going to try and answer two big questions this evening. How can Sydney more effectively or most effectively expand its supply of truly and permanently affordable housing? And I'm going to give you some specific definitions in a little bit, but for right now, by truly affordable housing, I mean housing that is affordable to households who make 80% or less of the median income. So when we talk about affordable housing, we're talking about housing that is affordable to people who make less than 80% of the median income of the general area. And when we talk about affordable, we mean have to pay 30% or less of their income. So basically, and this is the definition we use in the United States as a policy matter, affordable housing is housing that is affordable to people who make less than 80% of area median income, and they pay a rent or a monthly housing cost that's less than 30% or less of their monthly income. And anything more is unaffordable. Okay, so that's this idea of what is affordable housing. And the second question is permanently affordable housing is this idea of where they have security of tenure for at least 5 or 10 years. So they have some certainty that they're going to be able to stay in affordable housing for 5 or 10 years or more. And that's actually quite a big challenge in and of its own. And the second question, which is, as we say in America, is ripped from the headlines. If you saw Ross Gittins' piece yesterday in the Morning Herald and saw Scott Morrison's response this morning, I thought sort of Morrison's response was he was going to bust some myths about affordable housing and negative gearing. I think he actually created more myths than he busted. But it's this question of what's the relationship of the planning system, and particularly the barriers that the planning system throws up to the production of housing and affordable housing. And what can we say about that? And again, I don't know incredibly a lot about these topics in Australia. I know a little bit about it, but I know a little bit more about it in the United States, and I'm going to try and share some of my observations. So I'm going to start by talking about the Sydney and New South Wales context as I see it as an American, spend a few minutes talking about what can we learn from the United States. Actually, I have to be very humble about that today because Donald Trump won 60 to 65% of the votes of the Republican Party yesterday in 5 American states. So my first reaction is to say, what can we learn from the United States? As of today, absolutely nothing, or what not to do. But maybe there are some things in the area of housing policy. I want to give you a bit more definitions and a bit more of understanding about what makes effective policy and not effective policy. And then I want to get into this question of focusing on 4 basically local options for expanding the supply of affordable housing. And I'll explore with them what they mean, and then see how they might work in Sydney. Which of those 4 might work more or less in Sydney? And then get to this question of what's the relationship of planning, regulations, supply constraints, and housing prices. We've done a lot of work on this in the United States over the last 25 years, and we have some pretty good understandings of what's driving what. So let's start with the New South Wales context. And this is just a series on housing prices done by AMP Capital here in Australia. since the late 1980s. Everybody starts at 100, and you can see that the United States in red, this is median prices for the whole country, rose relatively continuously. They went up even faster after 2005. They peaked in 2008. They fell hugely in 2008, 2009, and they're finally on their way to recovery. But it's the subprime meltdown, what we call the subprime meltdown, what you call the global financial crisis. You see a faster rise in the UK, less of a fall, and you see a faster recovery. And then here in Australia, you see a slight blip after 2008. But basically, from the perspective of the housing market, it's almost like the global financial crisis didn't exist. And we've seen a continued run-up in housing prices in Australia. I think all of you know that. And I think you probably all know the second slide, which is, this is the quote at the top, "We have met the enemy and they are us," is a quote from a cartoonist in the 1960s about the Vietnam War. And they are us it's you folks that are doing this. It's you folks in Sydney. If you look at housing prices in the major metropolitan areas of Australia, you can see they've gone up everywhere. But in the last 2 or 3 years, it's really been Sydney that's been driving it. You can see that in the orange circle, the rapid continuing rise in Sydney, which hasn't occurred in most other markets in Australia. And basically, as we look at the spatial pattern of these price increases, prices have increased the most in the eastern and western suburbs. And then when people can't afford prices in the eastern and western suburbs, they move out a little further and raise the prices there. So it's really the high demand areas in the eastern and western suburbs that are driving this. And I think most of the people, and if I had to guess, I'd say in the audience, many of you live in the eastern and western suburbs. So literally, you folks are the folks that are causing this problem. And so you have sort of, I think, a special responsibility to deal with it. I'm just here for a few months. It's not my job. So basically, this problem is a combination of things that are, it's a little things that are a little hot and a little too cold. On a little hot side, again, I think things that everybody in this room knows. There may be some differences in how other people interpret it, but it's not a tax relief system. Negative gearing is a tax avoidance system. And it's at the national level, and it's resulted in a lot of unproductive real estate speculation. And despite what Scott Morrison says, it has not resulted in a lot of production. I think that's pretty clear from the evidence. So we really see a lot of resources going into housing prices or not going into housing construction. And Ross Gittins, who I actually respect quite a bit, I don't have a lot of respect for Morning Herald journalists, but I think he's really one of the good ones, yesterday came out and said, we need to phase this thing out, okay, which is a pretty strong statement. So that's, we have too much speculation. We have continuous and ad hoc state level involvement in the local development approvals process. So you have state level, New South Wales levels, overrides of local approvals. That may be a good thing. It may be a bad thing, but it's got to be consistent, and it's not consistent. So if you're in a local council, you never know when the state's going to come in and decide that your decision is a bad one, and that's not a good thing for anybody, actually. I think the New South Wales government has been way too willing to take developer hardship claims at face value. So whenever a developer says, I need an extra 5 stories, or I need a little bit more of this, or I'm not going to make any money, rather than asking to see the developer's pro forma, they just say, okay. And that's not a good thing either. And then in Sydney and, of course, in Melbourne, apartments are seen as a safe harbor by Chinese investors. And this has fueled a lot of real estate speculation. I think some of you may know I live in the Herald Park project. And my wife is a member of PETA. I don't know if you have PETA here, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And so she's a little unhappy that we live on the site of a former dog track and harness racing park, but it's the only place we were able to get a 6-month lease. It's actually pretty good, but many of the units are owned by Japanese families. I'm serious, Chinese families, excuse me. That's fine, but and probably the project's a little too dense. Okay, those two things have nothing to do with each other, but. Nonetheless. So that's the things we have too much of. We have too much money chasing a lot of housing, okay? And we have it chasing a lot of housing in a planning system that's pretty uneven, Okay. What are the things that too little? Well, there's a lot of confusion over which levels of government, national, state, or the local level have responsibility for supplying affordable housing. Is it the national responsibility? Is it the responsibility of New South Wales? Is it Sydney? Is it my community of Glebe? I don't know. Do you know? Can you tell me whose responsibility is? It's hard for me to figure that out. We have municipal fiscal structures which don't recapture government-generated increases in real estate values. This is this idea of value capture, and actually there's some good discussion about how the government of New South Wales may impose a value capture system, which would be a change, and a welcome change. And from a design and planning perspective, what we have we've come to call in the United States, other places, the missing middle, okay? Which is, you don't see a lot of good new 3 to 4 to 5 story apartment buildings. Everything 6, 7, 8, 9 stories. My project is 8 stories. And that may be appropriate in some locations, but it's certainly not appropriate in other locations, and it doesn't necessarily create a good sense of community. And which isn't to say we don't want those projects, but we want this middle range of projects that's more than 2 stories, maybe less than 6 stories. And I haven't seen a lot of that in new construction here around Sydney. Maybe you may know more of it. So that's the context, I think. A little too much of some things, a little too little of other things. So what can a study of the U.S. bring? Well, first of all, you have 5 major metropolitan areas. We have 360. Okay, and so there's a lot more variation in things that are going on, and our system is a much more devolutionary system where local governments or metropolitan governments are encouraged to try different things. And so we have a lot more things going on in different levels, and we have a lot more observations, so we can make some comparisons that are actually pretty useful. There are a lot of good comparisons between in terms of the size and structure of Sydney versus many other American metropolitan areas and spatial structure, so we can get a good sense of that. We have a lot more competition over ideas in America than you do here in Australia. Basically, my take on what happens in Australia is one national party says one thing and the other national party says another thing, which is the opposite, and that's the end of the discussion, okay? There isn't a lot of debate about the details of policy and things like that. It's pretty much played out and so everybody adheres to their party line, whatever their party line is, and that's happening more in the United States, but it isn't as much in Australia. But there are confounding issues in the United States that you don't have here. Issues of race and ethnic discrimination and segregation are profound in the United States and almost in every city. Most American metropolitan areas exhibit a level of extreme or hyper segregation that doesn't occur here in Australia. And of course, private property rights are very entrenched in America, and they define a lot of things. Private property rights and the right to carry a gun. I mean, if I were giving a lecture in many parts of America right now, most of you would have guns. So that's a little scary, isn't it? I don't know. There's some differences here which make me glad I'm in Australia. So before we get to answering these 2 questions, let me start with a few definitions and sort of where I'm coming from and what research in America suggests about good affordable housing. I said before that we're going to define affordable housing as housing affordable to households making 80% or less of area median income. And frankly, I'm much more interested in housing affordable to households who make less than 50% of area median income. So we call that, that's extremely low income families, and that's what a lot of my discussion today is going to be, and it's going to emphasize. Oh, what?
They can't hear you at the back.
Oh, okay. Okay. Is the thing not working? I'll try the. Okay. 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 So a few other things. Anytime somebody says that private developers can provide affordable housing, don't believe them. Okay. There's no profit model in which a private developer, particularly given Sydney area land prices, can build housing that's affordable to a family who makes 80% or less of area income. Government has to take a role. The only question is, what role is that? In a market like Sydney, where there's a lot of growth and where there's strong preferences for historical housing forms and central locations, filtering really cannot work. Filtering is the idea that we build new houses at the top, and the people who buy those leave their houses available to people of lower incomes. And that can work in some markets. It works really well in Detroit, but you have to get the rest of Detroit in the bargain. But it doesn't work here in Sydney, where you're getting a lot of growth and you have very strong preferences for particular locations. Here's something that I think many of you might disagree with from an Australian perspective, but I think it's sort of figured out in America because of conflicting objectives between equity and value-based asset management. Government agencies, what we call public housing authorities in America, have great difficulty managing low-income social housing. They can build it, but managing it in a sustainable way over a long time is really difficult. In America, we've developed a nonprofit sector that does that much, much better than government as a whole. I don't know if that's the case here, but in America that's the case. The design and quality of low-income housing should not be fundamentally different from nearby market rate housing. We spent the first 30 years of affordable housing policy in America building housing projects that stigmatized their residents. That didn't work out so well. So today, almost all affordable housing project has to be subsidized by the government, has to be indistinguishable from market rate housing in the neighborhood. Good housing projects mix income groups, incorporate retail uses, and are conveniently located near public transit. I hope nobody disagrees with that. And lastly, local land use regulations which do not create measurable social benefits or mitigate community environmental costs are good candidates for elimination. If we can't show that our regulations are producing public goods or mitigating social bads, why are they there? Okay? And I think we have to apply that sort of level of scrutiny to just about all of the regulations that we apply. So let's look at this question of how to expand the supply of affordable housing. And I'm going to look at 4 models and apply them to Sydney. Before I do, I want to just sort of convince, why are we going to talk about local models of affordable housing supply? That should be the job of government, at the national government. In the UK, in Europe, it's the job of national government. In China, it's mostly the job of national government. But in America, it is no longer the job of national government to provide affordable housing. Why is that? And what are locals doing to fill that gap? And in some cases, there's some good stuff, and in some cases, some bad stuff. But anyway, let me give you some wonderful statistics that come from the Harvard Joint Center. They have a wonderful report that comes out every year called the State of the Nation's Housing. They also do terrific jobs. And better than just calculating the statistics, they actually employ journalists to explain in English what it means. So you can actually read the reports and get policy. I don't know how to do that myself, but I'm glad somebody at Harvard does. Anyway, so the black line, or what looks like the black line, so basically the problem in America is very simple. Rents have been going up, that's the orange line, and renter incomes have been going down. Okay? And partly that's because there was a period in the 1990s and 2000s when a lot of the upwardly mobile renters moved into home ownership. And now they're back being renters, but they've moved to home ownership. So the big problem in America is renters are poorer than they were before. You can see that in the black line, but rents have been going up. And this has created an affordability gap. And that gap has been widening, and you can see that here. And this has created a situation. Let's just look at even 1990. And the way we look at housing needs in America is by cost burden. Do you pay more than 30% of your income for rent if you're a renter? And if you pay more, then you are moderately burdened. That's the orange. And if you pay more than 50% of your income, that's half of your income for rent every month, you are severely burdened. Okay? So just if we look at 1990, 40% of all renters in America, not low-income renters, 40% of all renters in America were moderately or severely burdened in 1990. Okay? By 2010, that was up to 50%. So half of American renters pay more than 30%. And if you look at that orange slide, about 23% pay, if you look at that purple slide, it's about 30% pay more than 50% of their income on rent. And that's really a crisis. And when people talk about the crisis in rental housing, that's what they're talking about. And that's pretty much true everywhere. And as you can imagine, the lower your income is, so that first set of bar charts, again, the purple is severely burdened, the blue is moderately burdened. That first set of bar charts is households who are under $15,000 of income. And you can see that that's where the problem is concentrated. In 2001, of households who made under $15,000, 80% were moderately or severely burdened. That was up to about 85% in 2014. By the time we get to people who make this is US dollars, $45,000 to $74,000, we still see some problems. It's about 20 to 30%. But there are very few people who have extreme rent burdens at that point. So the problem is really concentrated among households who make less than $30,000. So we have a pretty good idea of who to target when we're having policy. Now, why has this occurred? Why has this rental affordability gap widened in America over the last, particularly over the last 8 years? And there are really three reasons. I just need to talk about them. The first is demographic. We've seen a growth in the size of the demographic groups who want to be renters. And look at the blue bars. And I'm not going to ask where individuals in this room fall on that in this line, whether you're 70 or over under 30. But the blue bars show you the growth in the demand for rental housing due both to what's called the household effect and to the preference for rental housing. And it's pretty sizable. So we've seen an overall growth in the demand for rental housing in America, even at the same time as we've seen a growth in the demand for home ownership. So there are more people chasing rental housing, and we've produced a less and less and less rental housing. If you look to the left of the blue bar, which was before about 1988, and you look at the orange line, that's multifamily starts. You look at the blue line, that's single family starts, and the yellow shows you the total. And you can see that from about 1970 to about 1988, multifamily or apartment starts or rental starts were about a third of, or about a half of single family starts. Okay, so pretty consistently, we built about half as many apartments as we built single-family homes, and that actually goes back about 50 years. And then something happened in the late 1980s, and rental housing construction just fell off the map. So we just stopped building new rental housing in America. So it's, in several years, we only built 1/10 as many rental apartments as we built single-family homes, ownership homes. So at the same time that demand was going up, supply was going down. Okay, and that shows pretty clearly here. I don't know to the extent that's the same problem here in Australia. And the last piece is that a lot of people who became homeowners in the period between 1990 and 2006, during the subprime meltdown or the foreclosure boom, they lost their homes and they moved back in as renters. So we saw a huge influx of renters, further stress on the market from homeowners who lost their homes, and that's shown here. Here you can see the home ownership rate over there on the right, and you can see that it rose from about 64% in about 1990 all the way up to about 68%. That's a difference of about 5 million households, by the way. And now it's back down to 64%. Those people didn't disappear. Unlike me, they didn't move to Australia. They moved to a rental unit, putting further pressure on the rental housing stock. Now, and that has caused this hugely widening gap in the demand and supply of rental housing. If we look at 1999, that orange and gray bar are the number of units that are available, affordable units that are available, and the purple bar is the number of people who need units, okay, number of households who need units. So if we look in 1999, there was a gap of about 2 million units nationwide on the affordable housing stock. If we go to 2011, that gap has widened to about 4 to 5 million units. So in the last 15 years, we've seen an already large gap widen even further. And again, it's widened because we've seen an increase in demand and a decrease in supply. And I think some of these same things are happening in Australia. This problem has mostly happened on the mountain regions in the West Coast. That's the orange, where the share of renters who pay more than 30% of their incomes for rent. You can see there's California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Oregon. That's where the big renter burden problem is located. Georgia and Florida, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut. So it's not uniform across the country, but it is in a lot of markets. Now, who cares? Okay, who cares? Why should we care? I have a nice house. I don't pay too much. You have a nice house. I don't think you probably don't pay much. Everybody has to struggle for rent now and then. What's the problem? Okay, I'm not sure. But there's some really good evidence it's a big problem. And the big problem is if you pay a lot for rent, you don't have enough money left over to do the other things you need to do. It's obvious at one level, but this analysis, which again comes from the Joint Center, shows exactly what's the difference in people's spending patterns, what money they have available for other things, depending on how much they have to pay for rent. So again, if you look at the purple bar, that's what people spend on food, monthly outlays on food. if you can afford your house, you spend about $350 on average. If you're living in, if you have to pay a lot more of your income for rent, you only get to pay in about $200. It's a big difference. If you have a family of 4, the difference between $200 and $350 is a big difference, okay? On money you have less for food. Healthcare, same thing. Transportation. Transportation is about getting to a job. You suddenly have a lot less mobility to get to job. Retirement, you have very little. I'm not sure we should care about entertainment, but it just goes to show that, you know, these high rents really do matter. They do impact people's lives in a very tangible and important way. And again, remember, many of these people are people who are starting out with incomes of $15,000 and $20,000. So when policy makers stand up and say there's no rental affordability problem, you know, tell that to the people who, you know, at the end of the month can't afford to go shopping. It's a big issue, and it's often a very hidden issue, at least in America, and I suspect in Australia. But the deeper problem is that it's the intergenerational persistence of poverty. And this is documentation that comes from the Pew Charitable Trust. It takes a little while to read it, but it basically, if you divide the income distribution into quintiles, that one on the left is the poorest quintile. It's the poorest 20% of households. The one on the right is the richest quintile. I'm not going to talk about the one on the right. I'm going to focus on the one on the left. And basically, if you're born in a poor household, if you're a child born in a poor household, the chances are 4 out of 10 that you're going to live in poverty your life. Okay? So if you're born to one of these households that has a severe rental problem, you're going to have a lot less upward mobility throughout your life than if you're born in the middle quintile, where only 14% are going to be poor. So this problem with high rents transmits itself intergenerationally and robs many generations of a lot of things that they might get. So this problem is not new. The gap has widened over the last 10 years. So how do federal policy makers deal with it? Once upon a time, they actually tried to deal with it. The heyday of affordable housing policy in America was the 1930s to the 1980s. In the 1930s, we built about 2.5 million public housing units in America, mostly in the cities. Government built public housing. It was pretty good housing. Unfortunately, it was government run. That was not the good part of it. And which the federal government paid for, first capital construction subsidies and later operating subsidies to local authorities to build and operate public housing. That stuff got old pretty quickly. Today, there's only about 1.8 million of those units left. A lot of them have been withdrawn from the stock. And then in the 1970s, we switched approaches. We went from a public housing construction approach to a housing voucher approach. Rather than build public housing for poor people, I don't think that happened as much here in Australia, we decided to give poor people money and let them find housing in the private market, using housing vouchers. That's still the dominant form of housing, a subsidy assistance in America. About 3.5 million poor families get housing vouchers. In the 1980s, the problem with housing vouchers is they don't create new supply. Okay, they just enable poor families to find housing in the private market, but they don't create new supply. That was recognized in the 1980s, and we implemented something I talk more about called the low-income housing tax credit. By far the most successful affordable housing project approach in history, okay, in America. Okay, it's generated 2.3 million affordable housing units over the last 30 years, and most of those are affordable to people who make less than 50% of area median income. It's extremely expensive, but it's highly targeted, and it works very well. And then there was a small uptick in the 1990s where we went back and knocked down some old public housing and rebuilt it as low-rise, mixed-use, mixed-income housing, and that was something called Hope 6. Now, that sounds pretty good, but when you actually add it up, it's not as good as it sounds. So basically, if you look at the number of people who are eligible for assistance versus, or number of households who are eligible for assistance versus the number who receive it. Okay, you're, again, eligible for assistance in America if you make less than 80% of area median income and you pay more than 30% of your income for housing. That makes you eligible. So what share of households actually receive it? Well, that line, the orange line, shows you the share. In America, it started off at around, it was never 100%, but in 2003, it was about 27, 28%. It's now down to 24, 25%. So only 1 in 5 American households who are eligible under the definitions of policy that the government puts out actually receive any form of housing assistance. And the reason is, again, quite simple, and it's very political, and it's the same in Australia, in that total housing assistance, which is the dark line, has hardly budged, okay, in real terms in the last 40 years. You can see that spending on social services, food and nutrition assistance, Medicaid have all gone up, and that's important. Those are good services. They're absolutely necessary services, but I think shelter is also pretty necessary, and it hasn't gone up at all. And so, I don't know what the numbers are in Australia, but I think this sort of analysis helps make some interesting comparisons. So, the federal government has not expanded its efforts over the last 30 years to supply affordable housing to low-income families. The number of low-income families has gone up, and rents are going up as demand goes up. So who's going to fix it? Who's going to pick up the pieces? And the answer is, not because they want to do it, because they're the last person left in the room, local government. Okay? So I'm going to talk about 4 approaches to getting affordable housing built that have happened in local government, and then I'm going to see if I can see how they might work in city. The first is the low-income housing tax credit program. Now, as many of you in the room know, okay, this is a federal program. You get to, so you have a housing developer who places or syndicates the tax credits with a corporation, usually a financial corporation, and in the course of selling those tax credits to the financial corporation, they usually raise about 75% of the cost of building an affordable housing project. It's roughly 75%. That's about the maximum they can do. And so it's and then the corporation gets to reduce its tax amount. It's a credit, not a deduction. Gets to reduce its taxable income by the value of the credit. So if I'm ANC Bank and I were to buy $10 million of tax credits, I would get to reduce my taxable income by $10 million. Okay, so it's a nice program, and it's worked very well. As I said, it's generated about 2.3 million units over the last 30 years, and it's a federal program, but it's administered locally. It's administered by states. Okay, so that's pretty local. And then, since it's only 75% of construction cost, you got to come up with the other 25% somewhere else. Okay, and that somewhere else is usually local government. So in order to make this thing work, local government has to usually step up to the plate. And they know this and everybody understands it. So even though it's a federal program, it works because local government is involved, state, local government involved. I said 2 million here, 2 million, 2.3 million, almost all affordable to households who make less than 50% of their income. Why does it work? It's phenomenally successful. It's extremely expensive, but it's phenomenally successful. It works quietly through the tax code. You don't need a big bureaucracy to do it. In fact, if you're familiar with it, you can actually take the cost of setting up one of these systems against the credits. So you can recover the cost, the syndication cost, through the credits. That's actually very nice. So it has very low administrative cost. The competition rewards high quality development. Nationwide, only about 1 in 3 developers who apply for these credits get them. So it's very competitive. And it's competition on quality, okay, as opposed to politics. So the competition rewards high quality development. It's transparent, but it's not easy. It's not easy to, I know some of you in this room have put together these applications. They're not easy to do. You have to know your stuff. The project has to work. It has to work for the tenants. Okay, so everybody knows how the game is played, and you have to work real hard, and that work shows up in high quality development. And then, as I said before, it effectively leverages local funds in a very good way. So it's depending on where you are, the cost per unit is anywhere from $100,000 US to, in New York City, the cost per unit is about $250,000 US to produce an affordable unit with this program. So we'll come back to that. Second program. This is old. It's really old. That's a guy named Ed Koch. He was the mayor of New York. And, and he was a rather insecure person. He was always running around saying, how am I doing? How am I doing? People have likened him a little bit to Donald Trump. I don't think that's fair to Ed Koch. But in 1986, after he had sort of restored New York City to fiscal health, he said, what do I do next? And he looked around and he saw that, there was a huge affordable housing problem in New York. And just basically, you know, because he was sort of a little like Donald Trump, he just sort of said whatever he came into his mind. He went on the radio and said, I'm going to build 100,000, the city of New York is going to build or preserve 100,000 units of affordable housing in the next 10 years, okay? No mayor had ever said that. And that's the stuff that national governments do. But no mayor had ever gone on the radio, on the public record, and said, I'm going to build 100,000 units of affordable housing. And everybody congratulated him and said, what a great thing to do. And said, Ed Koch, he said, well, if 100,000 is good, even 200,000 would be even better. So the next month, he raised it to $200,000. And he didn't know where he was going to get the money, and he didn't know how he was going to do it. He just said, we're going to do it. And he meant it, okay? So over the next 10 years, okay, through about 20 or 30 different programs run by something called the Department of Housing Preservation and Development in New York City. The city of New York went into the capital market, went into the bond market, and borrowed $5 billion. No city had ever borrowed anywhere near this much amount of money to direct toward the preservation and development of affordable housing. It took a little more than 10 years. It took 14 years, but over 14 years, they built 183,000 units of affordable housing affordable to people made less than 80% of area median income at an average cost of $28,000 per unit. It's the greatest municipal housing success story in American history. And here's just some examples of some of the programs. I said there were about 28 programs that they did. Housing rehabilitation programs, new construction programs. Why were they able to do it? First and foremost, the mayor said they were going to do it, and he was not going to back down. He was going to see to it that they actually got it done. When was the last time you took a mayor at face value? I mean, you know, when a mayor had, you know, felt like, I've got to deliver on this stuff, he delivered. They started with a large supply of city-owned properties, which in New York they call in-rem properties. So they actually had an existing base of things to improve. And the problem at the end of the 14 years, they actually ran out of these homes. Okay, so as they got into the planning process, it got more and more expensive because they ran out of these city-owned properties. But most importantly, they built the most effective housing production bureaucracy that America's ever seen. That's the Department of Housing Preservation and Development. And these were people who worked for the city who basically saw themselves as housing preservationists and housing developers with a very high level of expertise. And the former head of that organization, Sean Donovan, when Obama became president, became the Secretary of HUD. He's been the most successful secretary that we've had in the US history. There was institutional and programmatic flexibility, but mostly, cities, when they want to build transit systems, when they want to build highways, when they want to build hospitals, they go into the bond market and they borrow. When they want to build housing, they don't do that. Most don't do that, but Koch says, we're going to do it. And he went into the bond market and he borrowed $5 billion, and that money was repaid early, okay? So it's an amazing success story, but it took a level of political leadership and a level of competence on the part of housing planners that we don't see in most places. Let me talk about inclusionary zoning. Developers hate inclusionary zoning. Their argument's very simple. It's a good argument, okay? You're going to tell us we have to provide affordable housing. We didn't create the problem. Why are you making us solve it? And it's true. Most of the developers didn't create the problem. The problem is one of supply and demand. Okay, developers want to solve the problem, but now we're going to turn around and say to developers, even though you didn't create the problem, we're going to make you responsible for solving it. And they say that's not quite fair. And it's a legitimate point. Okay, but I don't think it takes you all that far. So how does inclusionary zoning work? Think about it in terms of three ratios, okay? What I'm calling X, Y, and Z. If you're a developer of a project larger than X many housing units in the US, it's somewhere between 20 and 50. Okay, if you develop more than 20 to 50 housing units, you have to set aside some percentage of those housing units for rental or ownership for households who make less than 80% of area median income. That second percentage is usually somewhere between 10 and 20%, okay? What's the income cutoff? It's usually 80% of area median income. So we have about 200 inclusionary zoning programs in the United States. The typical threshold size is about 20 units. The typical inclusionary percentage is about 15 to 20%. And you have to help households who make 80% or less of area median income usually become homeowners. So it's not a deep subsidy program. It's not getting at the people who have true needs. And there are lots of variations on this. Some of it's mandatory, in some places mandatory, in some places voluntary. So it's voluntary that we sort of bribe the developers to do it. Do you have to provide the units on site with your original project, or can you move them to another project? Or in lieu of that, can you just give the money to the government and say, here's some money, you fix the problem? There's some variations. In some places, you can't tell which is an inclusionary zone unit and which is not. That's the issue of anonymity. Resale restrictions, almost all of these programs have resale restrictions. So if you sell your unit in the first 10 years, you have to share the equity gain with the government. And lastly, if the market turns south, there are provisions for temporarily lifting it. The first municipality in America to do this, and the most successful, is Montgomery County outside of Washington, D.C. They actually did it in 1974. And to date, every year they produce a few hundred units, and to date they produced 14,000 units of inclusionary zoning. Programs changed a little bit. Now, again, when it started, the usual threat by developers is if you do this program, we're going to leave Montgomery County and go some other county. They never do, okay? It's an empty threat, okay? You're only going to put inclusionary zoning in a place where there's a strong market for housing, and that's exactly the market a developer wants to be in. So it's a very impressive story. So there's no downside to inclusionary zoning. There are lots of statements about what a problem is, but there's no downside to it. As I said, about 200, I hate saying Wikipedia is my source, but the reports on this are about 10 years old, and Wikipedia is a little more current. So about 200 municipalities have now done it, different flavor shapes. Unfortunately, the only big cities that have done it are mostly California, San Diego, San Francisco, Sacramento. Those are strong market economies. In other places, the developers have sort of cowed the city governments. And until last month, the developers had cowed the city governments in New York too, but Mayor de Blasio just announced last month that he was going to impose mandatory inclusionary zoning in New York City. So we're going to see a lot more of that. Again, it has a lot of advantages. It's easy and inexpensive to administer. In most instances, you're not separating the low-income tenants. There's no evidence that it undermines the properties. It's easy to impose resale restrictions. And when it doesn't overreach, in America, it passes constitutional muster, which is important. There are some problems with it. You can't get a deep subsidy with it. It's mostly for people who make about 80% of area median income. And it doesn't produce enough housing units overall to reduce the overall supply of housing. So lastly, let me come to this idea of community land trusts, which are very in vogue in America right now. And this is the idea that the city or a nonprofit organization establishes a community land trust, and usually the city gives it some empty, vacant land that the city has in its stock, and so that the land trust gets it for a very low price. They enter into a long-term renewable land lease with a developer or homeowner in exchange for a discounted lease rate. The developer or homeowner agrees to preserve long-term housing affordability. So I, as the community land trust, I would continue to own the land, okay? I would lease the land to you. You would hire a developer, or you might be a developer. You're going to build affordable housing. The rent on that affordable housing is not going to have to cover the land part. It's only going to have to, or the mortgage is only going to have to cover the housing part. So you've suddenly reduced the land cost part of housing, and an agreement for getting a much lower price or a much lower rent, you agree to keep that affordable. Okay, and this, as a lot of cities in America have a lot of excess land, or have had a lot of excess land, some obtained from foreclosure. This has become a very popular strategy. There's some examples of some of the places that are currently doing it. The Genesee County Land Bank is perhaps the best known. That's in Flint, Michigan. It's a very good strategy for community development. And again, it can be used with other funding sources to enhance affordability. It has some problems. It doesn't scale well, and it can't create market demand in blighted neighborhoods. It's not a good catalyst for redevelopment. Okay, so let's sort of sum this up. Okay, let's look at 5 criteria for good local affordable housing production programs. The first is, what's the potential to help the poorest households? Okay. Second is, what's the potential for permanent affordability to keep people in those units, affordable units, for a long period of time? Third is, how much does it cost per unit? What's the potential to achieve other goals or to leverage other resources? How difficult is it to administer, and does it scale? Can you grow the program so it starts to produce a lot of units? And you can see here that these different programs, this is my assessment, the low-income housing tax credit, the ones in orange are the places that do well, does very well in helping the poorest tenants. It does very well on permanent affordability, and we've seen it's very scalable. 10-year housing plan was very high in terms of permanent affordability, but in some of these other places, it's been harder to replicate. Inclusionary zoning is very good on cost per unit, cost the public sector very little. And it's also it's very good on administrative costs. And it's pretty good on other areas as well. And community land trusts has a very low cost per unit produced because basically the land is free. But the big issue in community land trusts is it doesn't scale well. How am I doing? 10 minutes. Okay. So where does this take us for Sydney, New South Wales? I think it takes us back to a policy that was tried and then discontinued here in Australia, which is the low-income housing tax credit. Makes an Australian version, but its potential to produce a lot of units cumulatively and to units that are long-term affordable and are affordable to households with the lowest incomes is quite spectacular. Australia has a 30% business tax rate, and it's not easy to get it lower. It's much easier in America to reduce it, but in Australia it's pretty hard, which means there's a market for selling credits for people who know how to sell their credits. The financial community is quite sophisticated here. The nonprofit community is not quite as sophisticated as in America. The credits can raise funds to pay for more expensive projects, and the allocation scheme can be tweaked easily to achieve other goals. I know the program exists here in Australia. I know it's sort of in abeyance, but it's of all the programs that we've looked at, it really is the best, and because of its potential for deep subsidy. There are some issues with it, basically associated with the capabilities of the nonprofit community, but that's a capacity that can be built. Remember, New York City built an amazing housing agency over 5 years. You can build capacity. Okay? You can't create funding where there's no funding, but you can build capacity. The other thing is, again, I'm a big fan of inclusionary zoning. Again, there's no downside to this. It doesn't provide as deep a subsidy. It doesn't scale quite as well, but it's hard to see any downside. But you do have to sort of make it sensitive to the local context. So let me say a little bit now about this second issue, the one that's very much in the headlines in the Morning Herald, which is, does the planning system reduce the supply of housing, and by reducing the supply of housing, cause the price to go up? Okay, and you're seeing that a lot. I mean, Scott Morrison said it in the paper today, and I wanted to investigate that issue a little bit more. This has been a big issue in America. A fellow named Bernie Frieden wrote about it in the 1970s, about how the planning system was destroying the supply of affordable housing. And so we've been dealing with that in America for about 40 years. So I'm going to go through this very quickly, but let me just touch on a few highlights and then get to my conclusions. Okay, if the planning system was the principal reason that prices are so high, then one would expect to see the prices the highest in the places that have the least friendly planning system to developers. So let's look at housing prices in America, and that's the Case-Shiller Index, which is the most reliable measure of housing price appreciation in America. What they do is they come back and they look at the same house when it sells. Okay, so they don't have to deal with the changes in quality. They're looking at the exact same house when it sells at a later year, asking how much does its price go up. It's called repeat sales. And at the top, the place that had the highest level of housing price appreciation in the early 2000s and then fell the most was Phoenix, okay, which is a very developer-friendly planning regime. So if you're going to argue that planning restrictions raise the price of housing, you got Phoenix there. Okay? You got Los Angeles there, which isn't quite as friendly, but pretty friendly. You got Tampa, okay, which was not only super friendly to developers, but committed all sorts of mortgage fraud, okay? Which is Tampa was ground center. Tampa and Orange County and Las Vegas were ground center for mortgage fraud in America. So in Tampa, it's easy to build and easy to get a bad mortgage, okay? And in fact, but there's San Francisco. Okay, San Francisco, as I'll show you in a minute, is the least friendly city in terms of planning regime to housing construction. And it's up there too, but it's not as high as Phoenix and Tampa. So if it's the planning system, then why are places like Boston and San Francisco, which have much more difficult planning systems, not higher? Okay. So let's just do a little, I'm going to not talk about this. So what's the theory of how the planning system can cause housing prices to go up? Here basically are 7 arguments about how a bad planning system can cause housing prices to go up. Number 1 and 2 are the only ones that matter, really, as far as I'm concerned. Limits on resource land available for residential development. So if you constrict the supply of land, both fringe land or urban land, redevelopment land, you're going to restrict the supply of housing. That's going to cause prices to go up. Pretty clear. Okay? Ad hoc limits on upzoning and retention, or the other way, people are downzoning land in high demand or redeveloping neighborhoods. So if you make it impossible to redevelop, you're going to limit the supply of housing. Prices are going to go up. Those two, that's pretty strong. Urban growth boundaries and limit lines, another argument. Inflexible zoning that prevents mixed-use housing in redevelopment areas. Ad hoc or environmental or community mitigations that add to construction costs but don't actually mitigate any problems. Lengthy and uncertain reviews squeeze the development pipeline, adding to developer risk premiums. Developers always cite this, but you can't actually find any evidence of it. And a big one, excessive parking requirements and if subdivision requirements, they can add to cost, but nobody's parking in those parking spots. That's the theory. There's a lot of evidence on 1 and 2, and I'm going to just, I think I'll make this my second to last slide and get to my policy conclusions. So I just did some summary comparisons between Houston, Portland, and San Francisco. Okay, so, and these are important cities. Houston is completely unregulated. Okay, if you look at the Houston regulatory regime, they have no zoning, they have no environmental impact assessment, something Nicole reminds me about every day when she tells me about all the housing that's next to the toxic waste dumps and refineries. She has pictures of that too, so there's no environmental impact assessment. And if you go to a public meeting and protest housing development of any type, they'll throw you out. They won't listen to you. There's no public participation. Okay, so basically it's developer heaven. Houston is developer heaven. Okay, now what do you get? Okay, what do you get for that? You get a median housing price now of $146,000 against a median income of $59,000. Okay, so for less than 3 times your income, you can afford to buy a house. Okay, you get a bigger house. 25% of the houses have 4 bedrooms or more. Okay, you get more garages. Okay, but a lot of those garages are used for storage, because when we actually look at percentage of households who own 3 or more cars, it's actually the same in San Francisco as it is in Houston. And you get much lower rents. The median rent $910. The median vacancy, the vacancy rate was 10%. But you still have people have severe affordability problems in Houston. Very high rent burdens. So while this system keeps housing prices down, it's not keeping rents down in Houston. The developer-favored regulatory system works for the benefit of home builders. It does not work for the benefit of tenants. Okay? Let's go to Portland, which Portland is the opposite of Houston. It's the most regulated city in America. It's the only American city to have an urban growth boundary, but it's a formal regulation system where there are manuals that show you what the regulations are. So if you're a developer, you look up in the manual and you know what regulations you are subject to. It has strict zoning, okay, including as-of-right zoning. So if you're in an as-of-right zone, you know exactly what you can build. It has environmental impact assessment. It has moderate public participation. And then it has an urban growth boundary. Okay? So in terms of formal regulation, it's the most regulated city in America. And you see that. The price is $361,000. It's quite a bit more. The median income is the same as Houston. You don't get quite as big a home as you do in Houston. You still can have 3 cars, though. We love our cars in America, what can I say? So the price-to-income ratio in Portland, the most regulated system in America, but formal regulation is about 6 to 1. Now let's go to San Francisco. San Francisco, which everybody wants to go to apparently, is the most ad hoc system of regulation in the country. Okay, there's zoning, but there's no as-of-right zoning. So if you're a developer and you show up to a meeting and say the zoning says I can build this, guess what? You're not going to be able to build it. Okay. There's an extensive environmental impact assessment process, which means if we couldn't get you on the zoning, we'd get you on environmental impacts. There's maximum public participation. Doesn't matter. You don't need to have any standing. If you don't like the project, you can come in and you can basically, cause a riot. So you can imagine what happens is developers show up in San Francisco to protest other developers, okay, to stop them from building, or they hire people. So it's a completely ad hoc system, okay, which creates enormous supply constraints. I think it's fair to say that San Francisco is at least as popular in America as Houston, okay? Between 2000 and 2010, the size of Houston in terms of population expanded by 26%. Those people would have preferred to go to San Francisco. I think many of them, not all of them, but many of them. But San Francisco only grew by 5%. That's a supply constraint, okay? And that's caused by that planning system, and you see the results in prices, okay? The median price last quarter was $1.13 million in San Francisco, which is 14 times the median income. So be like Portland, okay? If you don't want to be like Houston because it's pretty bad, okay? You don't want to be like San Francisco because there are no rules. The rules don't matter, okay? You want to be like Portland, where if there are rules, they're written down, they're codified, they're followed consistently, okay? And Portland's a pretty nice place, I have to say. Okay, now, so where does this leave us in Sydney? So let me just synthesize this. Planning regulations do have a big effect on housing prices. The effect is biggest when they inhibit new supply. I'm not as familiar with Sydney as many of you folks, but I've been around. I live in one of these places myself. I find in suburban communities around Sydney, I find no evidence that there are any supply limitations limiting the construction rates in suburban Sydney. Maybe Scott Morrison can show me where a developer couldn't build what they wanted to, but until he does, I see there's no evidence. The suburbs are growing pretty consistently. In developed neighborhoods, supply constraints happen through height limits and through formal and ad hoc limits on redeveloping former retail and industrial sites to housing. Again, I see little evidence of that. The symptom of this is empty industrial and retail and commercial buildings. They're waiting to be converted to housing, but that conversion isn't happening. And again, you don't see that very much in Sydney. You do see, former industrial space that will convert to a higher and better residential use, but that is happening. Okay, the pattern that exists in Detroit and Philadelphia and St. Louis of empty lots and empty buildings just doesn't exist here. Okay, it's hard to find any evidence of true supply constraints, as I would regard them in Sydney. But there are problems, so there are three tensions. Let me briefly talk about the three tensions that are inherent in all planning regulatory systems. And I'm going to argue that Sydney does a pretty good job resolving these tensions, but it could do better. And I'll tell you how it could do better very quickly. The first tension is developers will always want what they want, and they'll want it as fast as possible, and always threaten to leave the market unless they get it. Okay, that's what a developer learns in the first day of school. Okay, threats. Developer Donald Trump, same sort of thing. Okay. Residents of existing communities will almost always resist change and try to slow the development process to extract concessions from developers. You're stupid if you don't. Okay, a developer comes to town, he has the potential to make all sorts of improvements. Why aren't you going to try and extract those improvements? So that's how this problem sets up. Okay, these conflicts tend to be exacerbated in fast-growing markets where the most desirable sites are in short supply and where developers easily overpay on margin for land. Where developers are over-leveraged on their land purchases, that's where these conflicts happen the most. That is Sydney. Land prices are too high, developers have overpaid, they're very conscious of not being able to get the approvals that they want. Weak planning systems magnify these conflicts, strong planning systems reduce them. That's tension number one, the tension between developers and communities. Tension number two is tension between local governments and regional governments, or metropolitan governments, between councils and metropolitan government. In the name of consistency, development reviews by higher levels of government, states, and metropolitan areas will tend to favor physical growth and development as a manifestation of desirable economic development. Okay? So New South Wales is going to generally favor development because it sees physical development as the manifestation of economic development and prosperity. That's what states and big governments do. They can't help but not do it. So when people say, well, New South Wales is too pro-development, so is every other major state. Okay? This is the nature of big municipalities. Lower levels of government, municipalities, and councils will tend to oppose big new developments unless they can be assured that their local benefits will exceed the local costs, unless they can be assured that the community residents of the city aren't going to have to pay for the cost of development. And nobody can make those assurances. Nobody can convincingly tell the residents that development is always going to be good for them. Okay? Because the only way you can do that is if you have a cumulative impact evaluation system where you don't just look at each project, but you look at the project on top of the last 2 projects, on top of the last 3 projects, on top of the last 4 projects. So the only way you can, as a planner, you can convincingly say development is going to be good for you or not good for you is if you look at it cumulatively, and nobody does that. Okay? So the argument that development is going to be good for a neighborhood, you just can't make that argument generally. Okay? Tension number 3. Okay? The job of government planners is not to accede to the wishes of developers. Okay? Again, I know in New South Wales that's what the party thinks the job of planners is. It's to say yes to developers, but that's not, at least as I teach my students, not the job to accede to the wish of developers. It's to administer a project review system that's consistent and predictable and mitigate social costs and maximize the social benefits. Now here's the bigger problem. Consistency means applying less discretion. Consistency and predictability means you do the same thing and you do it in the same way. That's called less discretion. Okay? Mitigating social costs requires more discretion. Okay? Because you have to look at what those costs are and you have to figure out how to mitigate them. Okay? So you can't have consistency and deal with impacts perfectly. You can't do it because consistency requires less discretion. Dealing with impacts requires more discretion. Those two just cannot meet in the middle. Okay? So these are 3 inherent tensions in the political economy of Western capitalist systems. Okay? And you can't resolve them. They're tensions. Okay? You can just do a better job dealing with them. And I would argue that Sydney does a pretty good job, all things considered. Doesn't do a perfect job, but does a pretty good job in dealing with these 3 inherent tensions. Okay? It means that people get mad at each other and they write editorials and things like that. When you look at the built form that results, it's pretty good. Okay? Development happens in a timely way. It's not, for the most part, out of scale. It's pretty good. The only problem is it's not affordable. Okay? So, big problem, but I would argue that Sydney could do better. And let me just conclude by saying that the most innovative cities in the country are trying a different approach. And they don't call it horses for courses, but I call it horses for courses because I live in Herald Park, where it used to be a horse track. And any horse racing fans here, you know what the idea of horses for courses is? Who knows what horse? What?
Yes. Everyone knows we are a racing city.
What?
We are a horse racing city. Everyone.
Exactly. So what does it mean? So can you tell me what it means?
Yes, it means that you have to select the right means to get to the end.
Right. Different horses will do better and worse in different courses. Different regulatory processes are appropriate. Different planning processes are appropriate for different contexts. It's not a one-size-fits-all planning process. Okay? So a process that works well in certain neighborhoods won't work well in other neighborhoods. And what you see in places like Shenzhen and Vancouver and across California and even Detroit is that cities are adapting their regulatory processes for the conditions in particular neighborhoods and particular areas. And so here's an idea how to do that. It's very simple. So we're going to divide the city of Sydney and the surrounding areas into 4 zones. Okay? Shenzhen does this, California does this, Vancouver does this. The first are going to be priority growth areas where we have the infrastructure and infrastructure capacity for growth, like areas near transit. And those places, we're going to upzone them, and we're going to make development mostly as of right. So if the zoning says you can do 8 stories and you come in with a good 8-story development, you're in. Okay? Because we've identified that the capacity exists for that, priority growth areas. On the other hand, priority conservation areas are areas that in which either the built form or the form of housing is old, and we really value that, okay? And we think it's important for the social fabric of our city, okay? And new development is not necessarily appropriate there, and we've got to make that harder, and the burden of responsibility has to shift to the developer. 2 others in between, okay? Transition neighborhoods, areas open to new development forms and densities subject to local planning board reviews, where you do a very careful assessment of each project. You don't rule things out or rule things in until you do a very careful cumulative impact assessment. That's for the planners to do. And stability neighborhoods, which are neighborhoods where future development forms and densities should mostly follow existing forms and densities. And here, when a developer comes in, they have to submit a variance request. So if they want to do something that's really different, they have to submit a request for a variance, which says, and the idea of a variance is I want to do something different, and here's why, and here's how I'll solve your problems. So I think if we start to think about different planning systems for different types of areas, we can get consistency, okay, and we can also get the discretion where we need it. So I'm going to end there, and thank you all very much. I hope I've said some things that have been a little provocative, and I guess we have a few minutes for questions.